Welcome to the course, Introduction to Wildlife Management. Before we get started, let's take a wildlife management quiz, something we'll do throughout the semester. So our first question has to do with, what is a species? We're going to stick with the biological concept of what a species is. Species is a group of individuals that can reproduce or bear young. If they're not the same species, they're not able to reproduce. The next question we want to ask is, what is wildlife and how do we define it? While there is no precise definition, there is a definition that most wildlife professionals will refer to, and we'll talk about that in a few seconds. Early definitions only looked at wildlife as game animals, or animals that are hunted, or provide some other recreational activity. The definition has changed over time as the needs to protect and conserve wildlife have become much more important. Now let's talk about what wildlife is not. Sometimes it's easier to define something by telling you what it is not. In this particular case, wildlife is not considered an animal or a species that depends on us humans for food, water, shelter, or living space. So under this definition, we would not consider dogs, cats, planted gardens, cattle, sheep, or horses to be wildlife. As you can imagine, it's not always easy to define what wildlife is and what it is not. In this case of these pariah dogs that have never been domesticated and are free-ranging, would they be considered wildlife? While some wildlife professionals would not include them in the definition for wildlife, most wildlife professionals would include species that are free-ranging and that have never been domesticated as wildlife. For this course, we're going to consider all things that are living outside of human control. That means all organisms that are not cultivated or domesticated to be wildlife. While in the past this was not the case, today this definition would include insects, fungi, frogs, deer, doves, and even trees. So what are some attributes of wildlife that may help us to identify it better? Well, typically wildlife don't depend on humans for adequate food, water, shelter, or space to live and reproduce. Using these attributes, in most cases, you can identify what is and what is not wildlife. But even then, there are challenges. Now let's define the term wildlife management. Take a couple minutes to read these rather complex definitions of wildlife management. Don't try to memorize them. Just try to understand what they're trying to say. In a minute, I'll give you a simpler definition that we'll use throughout this course. For this course, we're going to define wildlife management as the practice by which humans work to strategically control wildlife populations, wildlife structures, distributions, or behaviors. In other modules, we'll tell you exactly what we mean when we talk about managing population sizes or structures. Don't worry about it for right now. Okay, time for another wildlife management quiz. What's a population? In general, a population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same geographic area and that interbreed with each other. Let's talk about a few goals of wildlife management. Here I've put them into 4 categories. We typically want to either increase a population, decrease a population, harvest a population, or monitor a wildlife population. Take a few minutes and see if you can understand what these general categories mean. Here's a couple more wildlife definitions that you should be familiar with. Native species. These are plants and animals that have evolved and are naturally occurring in a particular area or region and that are typically adapted to the soil conditions or climatic conditions of the area. Non-native species are organisms that do not occur naturally in an area, and many times they are introduced as a deliberate or accidental result of human activities. The great horned owl is an example of a Texas native species. They can be found throughout the continental United States as well as in Alaska. They actually range south into Mexico, Central America, and South America. Later in this course, we'll talk about what the terms habitat and range mean in terms of species distributions. Here's an example of a non-native species. This axis deer comes all the way from India and is a subtropical or tropical species. Originally brought here to be hunted, they have now escaped into the wild and are outcompeting some of our native whitetail and mule deer. Thus, their populations are increasing. Okay, let's finish up by defining the terms game and non-game species. A game species is usually one that is intended to be hunted or used for recreation, whereas a non-game species is not intended to be hunted or used for recreation. In most states, the terms game and non-game are defined legally, and so it's best to check with each state to know and understand the rules regarding game and non-game species.